Welcome. This webinar is presented by the SPECS program, Solar Plus for Electric Co-ops. I'm Jill Clyburn, the principal investigator on that project, and I have with me today David Sarkisian, who is the senior project manager from North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. North Carolina Clean Energy Tech Center is a partner on this project, which is part of the NREL Solar Energy Innovation Network. And what David has to present to us today is a presentation discussing the institutional and policy considerations for local electric co-op storage project development. And we consider that solar plus storage or storage alone. Next slide, David. So I wanted to tell you just real briefly about the SPECS project. Most of the people in our audience already know this. SPECS aims to increase the size and impact of battery energy storage in the local electric co-op market. In most of our project, we're focused on procurement. The idea that you're going to help the local co-op go through various avenues for developing that project and overcoming all those barriers and hurdles. In fact, co-ops face a lot of those. Most of those have to do with the very practical constraints at local co-ops, understanding the market. At SPECS, we like to say, you can't get what you need unless you know what to ask for. The other aspect of this, however, is that you can't get what you need unless you know the policy rules of the game. And so there are federal and state policies, as well as regional market rules and the relationships between co-ops and their G&T suppliers that really impact the way that solar plus storage projects can be developed and will be developed best. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar with the electric co-op sector, it covers a great deal of the country. There are 800 distribution co-ops, 60 G&Ts, which serve many of those co-ops, most of those co-ops' wholesale power needs. And at the same time, this is not a humongous percentage of the US retail sector. And yet it is a crucial part of the electric retail service across the country. We're hoping through this project that we can help all of the players in these relationships in order to make these projects happen and overcome the aspects that perhaps people working in more urban environments may not even be aware of. Next slide. So another background slide here, just a little bit about co-ops and renewable energy. The transition is actually underway. The progress that was made from 2010 to 2020 in the electric co-op sector is striking. Looking ahead, we're looking at already at more than 6.4 gigawatts of renewable energy expected to come on in the co-op sector by 2024. That may even be exceeded by the market trends that we're seeing today. And yet one of the big challenges in doing this is integrating those renewables into the markets, integrating them into local systems which need local balancing, and making sure that these relationships among co-ops that are all partners in G&Ts are well worked out. Next slide. So as we get into this today, I'm going to hand it over to David. Dave, tell us some of the things you're going to talk about and then proceed and give us the details.
All right, so my presentation today is based on a white paper that I have been working on for the SPECS project that lays out these institutional and policy considerations that electric co-ops need to look at when they're considering storage projects. And here I'm just laying out the order of these issues that I'm going to talk about. Probably the biggest single factor and the largest consideration tends to be the wholesale power contract between a distribution co-op and its G&T provider. And then we'll also look at some business models the distribution co-ops have used reflecting their G&T provider and wholesale power contract. And then outside of that central relationship, there are also policies at different levels of government, including state and local policies, federal policies, and then policies connected with the regional transmission organization or independent system operator in which the co-op is located, if it happens to be located in one at all. All right, so to first touch on this, the G&T utility and wholesale power contract area, I would say the vast majority of distribution electric cooperatives and in the United States get their generation from larger utilities referred to as generation and transmission utilities. Many of these are also cooperatively owned, often by a association of distribution co-ops. And distribution co-ops get their power from G&Ts through something called a wholesale power contract. This map lays out all the G&T cooperative service areas in the country as of 2016. Okay. So some of the contracts between distribution co-ops and their G&Ts are for fixed amounts in which the distribution co-op just purchases a defined amount of electricity or capacity from the G&T utility. And these sorts of contracts are pretty easy to work with in terms of the distribution co-op adding in its own generation or storage resources, as the contract won't limit the amount the distribution co-op can use beyond the floor amount that it has to buy from G&T. However, probably most of these contracts are all requirements contracts, in which case the G&T utility supplies all of the power, electricity, energy, capacity needs of the distribution utilities, save for certain defined exceptions. And these sorts of contracts are both more common and can be more problematic or restrictive of the ability of co-ops to install generation and storage on their grids. Okay. So all requirements provisions are, there usually is not an absolute bar on distribution co-ops installing their own resources. There are usually some provisions that allow for some degree of self-supply. Some of these exceptions are general. It would just be a certain amount of load or capacity that the distribution utility is allowed to supply. In our work, we've usually seen this to be around in the 5% neighborhood. And then there are other exceptions to all requirements provisions that can serve specific purposes. There can be generation that's allowed to support economic development, such as if it's located to serve a specific industrial customer or commercial customer. There can be provisions that allow distribution utilities to meet their obligations under the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act. And there can be exceptions carved out to meet state policy requirements like renewable portfolio standards and other state policies along those lines. And so beyond the all requirements provision, even when self-supply is allowed, the wholesale power contract usually affects the economic value of it through the rate design provisions. So contract provisions may just allow self-generation or storage to be credited to offset demand, which is usually the best situation economically. But then in other cases, the self-generation will just be credited based on the G&T avoided cost or prices in the wholesale market, which can be considerably lower than what the distribution co-op would be getting with the demand reduction. And then the G&Ts sometimes also incur additional charges for self-generation at the distribution co-op for backup service and transmission services that can limit the economic use case for self-generation. Okay, and an issue that comes up with these wholesale contracts, specifically storage, is whether it even counts as generation, because by the technical definitions of things, energy storage is not energy generation. And in fact, some all requirements contracts have been ruled to not limit the ability of distribution utilities to install storage to reduce demand. And it's would be, in these cases, be treated similar to a demand reduction programs. However, some contracts do include limits on storage or treat storage akin to generation. And this can be different if the storage happens to be directly paired with generation, such as part of a solar plus storage project that's all one unit behind the meter. So this can, if a storage isn't considered part of generation, it can present some issues for fixed cost recovery for G&T utilities. So we're seeing a little bit more acknowledgement of this, and some G&Ts are moving to more comprehensively address storage and wholesale power contracts, although that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as treating it as the absolute same thing as self-generation. And this is also something that doesn't come up just in a co-op utility environment. This has been an issue that's come up several times at FERC with regard to PURPA facilities selling to investor-owned utilities. Okay, and the last bit here, talking about wholesale contracts, is the possibility of renegotiation and updates to the contracts. Wholesale contracts usually have defined terms, but these can get updated either regularly as part of a standard update process or at the request of either side in the party, either party in the negotiation. And this possibility of renegotiation can present some risks for distribution utilities who have pursued or installed projects that rely on the existing contract terms. For instance, if utility installs a storage project to provide demand reduction, and then later on their wholesale contract is altered so that demand rates aren't as high. And this can be, you might ask, why would a distribution co-op do something that would, or agree to a contract change that would reduce the value of its project? Well, in this case, it might be that the overall demand charge reduction is good for the utility, but for that particular project, the value is reduced. And so, but this, even if there's overall benefits, utilities need to keep in mind the possibility that the contract rates could change, and keep that in mind when they're evaluating the economics of the project before it's adopted. So this is it's not an issue that can necessarily be solved. It just needs to be something that distribution co-ops keep in mind when they're evaluating projects, and it kind of gives a reason to have a good and communicative relationship between the distribution co-op and the G&T utility, just so they're aware of when, if and when rates are likely to change, and what the future stance of the G&T will be towards storage projects. Okay. So yeah, based on these considerations, there are a couple of different business models and organizational models have emerged for distribution co-ops to take advantage of energy storage. In some cases, distribution co-ops that are not part of G&T have installed storage independently for use on their own distribution grid. This is the case with Kit Carson Electric Cooperative in New Mexico. Kit Carson left its G&T a few years ago in order to pursue more aggressive renewable energy targets. And Kit Carson uses energy storage on its own grid. Another sort of model is for the distribution co-op to deploy its own energy storage assets on its own system, but to have that facilitated in some way by its G&T utility, who can provide assistance in terms of economic analysis and procurement for the storage assets. In some cases, distribution co-ops that want storage on their system have worked directly with their G&T to have the G&T procure storage and own the storage even when the storage is deployed on the distribution utilities grid. This is a model that some utilities in North Carolina, where I'm located, have used. And this model can kind of get around any limitations for the wholesale contract, as the storage capacity is directly owned by the G&T rather than the distribution co-op. This second class model with wholesale market participation isn't really exclusive of any of the other options, but just the fact that in places where there is an ISO or RTO, that can present a additional opportunity for distribution co-op owned storage or G&T owned storage to provide more value streams and possibly have additional economic benefits by selling into the local wholesale market. And this is a model we've seen used by some co-ops in Virginia through their G&T utility, the Old Dominion Electric Cooperative. And then last kind of side model here that we've also looked at a bit has been customer-sided storage. These are typically smaller projects, and in some cases, the utility will deploy utility-owned but customer-sized storage systems. This can provide similar benefits to utility-owned storage, and is something that might become more of interest with the expansion of DER aggregation that's become more feasible after FERC Order 2222. We'll discuss a little bit later. All right, so that kind of takes us through the wholesale contract and institutional side of things. But there are also policies from the state and federal government that can also affect the type of business model that distribution co-ops will choose to use when they're deploying storage. All right, so first to go through some of these, we'll start with state policies, and an obvious sort of policy that can affect storage goals is deployment mandates. And historically, these have typically been for renewable energy rather than storage directly, although renewable portfolio standards can encourage deployment of storage alongside renewables indirectly. Now, in many cases, these policies of either type don't necessarily directly affect co-ops due to specific carve-outs in the state language, or they can be different for co-ops as compared to investor-owned utilities. Now, in some cases, states have adopted storage deployment mandates. I'm not aware of any of these that directly target co-ops yet, but it's something to keep an eye on. Another policy area is compensation for storage, or required compensation methods from state governments. This is typically more of a residential scale issue, as it's tied to net metering considerations with solar, but we have seen some development for a kind of storage specific value components, such as the value stack in New York. And so that is something to keep an eye on as net metering policies evolve and take more, incorporate storage more comprehensively. A kind of emerging policy that's not taken off yet, but is only in effect in one state, is the clean peak policy, which is kind of like a renewable portfolio standard, but only targeting the area or the times of peak demand and aiming to get a generation at peak times to be renewable. And this is something that particularly involves storage, as storage is an important way to make variable renewable energy dispatchable at the peak, Currently, the only state which has a clean peak policy active is Massachusetts, which happens to not have any electric cooperatives. But it's possible that states that do have co-ops will adopt these policies as well. So it's something to keep an eye on. And another category is integrated resource planning requirements. Typically, these apply to the larger scale G&Ts rather than distribution co-ops, as they apply to generation resources, which many co-ops don't have or have limited amounts of. But these the integrated resource planning processes will require multi-year or even multi-decade plans from utilities to determine their resource mix. And lately, state regulatory commissions in many cases have been pushing utilities to look more comprehensively at storage as a resource option as storage has become more economically viable. And then a last area of state policy that's becoming increasingly important is distribution system planning, kind of an analogous process to integrated resource planning. As with integrated resource planning, the applicability to co-ops varies, but distribution system planning kind of highlights the dual role of storage as both a generation akin resource and a distribution and transmission style resource. As many regulatory commissions have encouraged utilities to incorporate energy storage into their distribution system as a non-wires alternative. I skipped a slide here. Yeah, so after the state policies, probably a more broadly applicable area and more widely known are the federal policies. Most important incentive at the federal level currently available is the solar investment tax credit, which has been around for a long time and was most recently extended by the stimulus bill in December 2020. This is for solar rather than for standalone storage. However, storage investment is eligible for the tax credit if it's paired with solar generation and is at least 75% charged with solar generation. Now, the ITC can be a little tricky to take advantage of for co-ops since they're nonprofit by nature. However, there are quite a few alternative organizational structures, such as using a third-party financer, that co-ops can use in order to take advantage of the ITC if they determine it's advantageous for a storage project. And another big area of federal policy comes from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which mostly concerns issues in the wholesale markets. A big area of FERC activity recently has been on Order 841, which is the rules for storage integration across the various wholesale markets. Most of the markets have gotten their storage rules completed, although some are still in the process of implementation on those. Another recent FERC order was Order 872 on PURPA reform, which has generally lessened the PURPA requirements for utilities and lessened the major impact was to reduce the size at which facilities can get offered standard contracts from utilities. Now, this is somewhat less impactful for co-ops, as the size of projects they're usually dealing with are not that large in the first place, but is still something to look at. And probably the most kind of the newest order here and the most interesting one for the future is Order 2222, which opened up wholesale markets for aggregation of distributed energy resources to participate. This is something that could allow more, but you usually think of residential scale resources to clump together and sell their value streams into the wholesale markets. However, it could also be a possible avenue of participation for distribution co-ops to add their resources into wholesale markets or to facilitate participation by customers. And again, as the issue we've talked about a little bit already is storage and generation capacity. This is something that FERC has not issued a firm ruling on yet. They've had an opportunity to do so with ruling on capacity size for a facility in Montana, but they ended up deciding that on alternate grounds. So we're not sure FERC's position on whether storage counts as generation capacity for PURPA purposes yet. As such, utilities and contracts tend to continue to make their own decisions there. Okay, and kind of a side note area for connected with the FERC policies are the individual rules and the independent system operators and regional transmission organizations. Because of Order 841, all of the ISOs and RTOs have adopted rules to allow storage to more fully participate. I should note that only the areas with initials here are actually ISOs and RTOs. The Southeast, Southwest, and Northwest regions are areas that do not have an ISO or RTO, but the other ones do. And so, and you can check out the policy paper if you want to see a more in-depth discussion of the rules that these various ISOs and RTOs have adopted for storage. One thing I will note is in ERCOT, the wholesale market for Texas, the ownership restrictions there have heretofore prevented distribution scale utilities from owning storage, as it's kind of treated as a generation resource there. However, an exception was adopted, specifically allowed municipal and cooperative utilities to own storage, and that's allowed cooperatives in Texas to kind of pioneer use of storage on the distribution grids. It'll be interesting to see in the future how once the rules are finalized in all of these grids for storage. Okay, so moving on, one activity the SPEC project has done, and this has been more on the technical side, has been creation of a economic model that lays out the value streams and gives co-ops a means to value the value streams they can get from storage projects. And what we've done here is kind of give a table that lays out how these policy issues that we've talked about can affect the different value streams that distribution co-ops can get from their storage. I'm not going to go fully through the table right now, but that's something you can look at more in the policy paper, and keep in mind if you want to cross-reference the policy paper with any of the economic analysis tools that SPECS has produced as well. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jill, who's going to give a little more information on the economic model. Thank you. Jill, you're muted.
Always a good technical issue. Well, thank you for that presentation. I think it's important to note that one of the reasons why we put this policy paper together again is that co-ops tend to know a lot about their own situation. If you're a co-op watching this, no doubt you have had experiences working with your G&T. You know what they're telling you. You know basically what you've got in your contract. In some cases, though, and I've had this experience working in the co-op and muni market, there may be small print in a wholesale power contract that escapes your view. Certainly, when these contracts were written, storage was not always top of mind. It's probably the last thing in the world that people were thinking about if the contract is some years old. So it's important to double check all these things, but also I think in the paper that David and I co-authored really goes into this a little more. There needs to be this balance between what the local co-op wants out of a locally sited storage project, and we're talking about mostly in front of the meter utility storage projects. So what they see from the local perspective and what the G&T sees from the G&T perspective. Also, as Dave just pointed out, there's the regional perspective. What does the market see? What does the state government see when they look at it from a policy perspective? And although they're unlikely to even have the imagining off the bat about what a local small town co-op might be doing, from the federal perspective, there may be a completely different perception of what policies will do compared to when you're actually standing on the ground in a local community. We also wanted to make sure that this policy paper reaches people outside of the co-op sector, and that's why we wanted to include some background on the co-ops themselves. A lot of times the developers that are working in this space have tremendous solutions, but they don't really understand what the questions or problems are. So it's really important for the developers to take a look at this. Some developers are definitely specializing on the co-op market and have a good understanding. There are also co-ops that are developing through organizations like, there's one called NRCO, the finance organizations like CoBank and CFC and so on. But there are lots of new players arriving in this market. And in order for things to shake out as the best possible outcome, everybody needs to be involved in the discussion. So as David said, we developed a lot of tools and we have the websites, which you'll see in a minute. But one that I really wanted to bring to your attention is when we talked in the last slide on the table about value streams. If you want more information on that, check out the tool that we developed and the user's guide, which goes into really more detail than a typical user's guide might, about how you can take this very simplified spreadsheet tool, use it as a screening tool in the early stages of program planning and decision making, go through the first go, no-go decisions. And then also, by the time you go through that, be well educated for those discussions with those procurement partners. That's really our mission. Again, trying to bring people to the table in a way that they can work together to get the best possible outcome. Next slide. So I wanted a question that occurred to me while David was presenting. I wanted to just bring up was, how do you get more information? The paper itself goes into a lot more detail, but it's still kind of a guide to make your own checklist. You make your own checklist, like I need to look into this, I need to look into this. Then, David, where do you go to actually do the looking into? What can you explain how some of these resources work?
Sure. Well, on the policy paper itself, it has a very extensive resource list and points readers to more in-depth discussions of many of these policy issues and considerations. We also have the other resources that have been produced by the SPECS project, which will be available both on the SPECS project page and through the Clean Energy Technology Center. Here it's a link to the Clean Tech Center page, which will then have a page specifically for the SPECS resources. Another resource that has more information on policies is the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency. This is a project run by the Clean Tech Center's policy team, which I'm a part of, that lists lots of policies of applicability to energy storage and to renewable energy. That's pretty comprehensive, covers pretty much it does cover every state in the country. it may not have every single co-op specific things and to do with, particularly to do with wholesale contracts, but for things to do with state, federal, and even local policy, Desire is a very good resource. And then lastly, there are some resources available on this topic from the Community Solar Value Project, which is we have one below. Jill, if you want to expand a little more.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the Community Solar Value Project site has been up for, oh golly, 5 or 6 years with lots of resources for co-ops and munis developing local, I call it community scale. We're transitioning also, so if you search for solarvalueproject.com, you'll get to the same place. As we expand our vision of integration, we're doing more work on that, and the specs project has its own page with some sub pages walking you through all the major steps in the procurement process, including checking the policy. David, unless you have some final thoughts, have we missed anything on this little webinar?
Well, I'm sure we have, but for now I don't have anything specifically to cover in addition to what we've talked about before. But yeah, it's been a pleasure working on this project. I'm really looking forward to what we see utilities being able to do with the products we've produced. So yeah, please, if you have any questions or want to find out any more, please reach out to either Jill or I using the contact information here.
Great. Thanks a lot, David.